Welcome to the next lesson in our growth group series entitled Gods at War. Today we're going to discuss the topic and learn about the topic of the God of money. Let me start by telling you about the day in September 2008 that the worst thing possible actually happened. That was the time that God died. No one would have imagined it. And you see, this God had seemed so immortal. No one was more surprised than his most dedicated disciples. His health had never been stronger. His influence was global. When God died, several of his most influential churches shut down. Most of the people who followed him lost their religion overnight. They depended on God for their future. What were they going to do now? The news of God's death brought mourning all around the world. Governments tried to resuscitate him, hoping that maybe he would show some kind of signs of life. People argued over the cause of God's death. They argued over how long he would stay dead. They'd put all their hopes and dreams in God. They'd invested their time and money in worshiping him. They counted on God to take care of them and keep them safe. Now it was like they had nowhere to run. Their God had seemed so powerful until now. He had provided better lives, bigger houses, faster cars. You remember the time when God died? At least that's what it felt like to a lot of people when the economy seemed to collapse in 2008 and a recession seemed to be imminent. You see, the God of money has been around for a very long time. Many years ago, you knew him as gold or silver. Before that, he was heads of cattle or animal skins or anything that could be traded. Now he's known as cash, dough, bacon, Benjamins, moolah, hundies, and on and on. He might be in the form of a plastic card or be a file named portfolio. Before his health took a turn, the God of money had become more powerful than ever before. In the old days, money was important, but the king had most of it. His palace would be surrounded by hordes of common people who had no wealth and no hope of ever having any. Then the world began to change. Democracy created somewhat of a level playing field in the Western world. He was the star of the American dream, and when people talked about their pursuit of happiness, what they were really saying was the pursuit of the God of money. Money has grown so dominant in our culture that it's difficult for us to stand far enough back to get a proper perspective. No matter what we may say, many of us live for the pursuit of wealth. And that has become our real goal in life. Sometimes we hear rich people say, money doesn't make you happy. But when they say that, most of us think that they all flew first class to some exotic destination where they got together and agreed to say that in order to make us feel better. We say we don't think money is all that important, but how we spend our time and what we pursue seems to reveal our true belief. Money has become the goal of so many people. When people talk about the ultimate fantasy, they talk about winning the lottery or maybe inheriting a fortune from a rich relative. Mark Twain once said, "Some men worship rank, some worship heroes, some worship power, some worship God. And over these ideals they dispute and cannot unite, but they all worship money." Luke 12:13 says this, "And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me." Now, this was probably a younger brother who was making this request. Maybe he was upset that according to the law, 2/3 of the family inheritance went to the oldest son when he only got 1/3 of it. And really, how you felt about the law was probably determined by whether you were the older or the younger brother. His question was not about money. He comes to Jesus wanting him to back up what he already believed about money and possessions. Does that sound familiar? Jesus uses this as a teachable moment when he says in Luke chapter 12, verses 14 and 15, "And he said unto him, Man, who made me judge or divider over you? And he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth." Now, Jesus makes the point that life is not about money. And then he goes on to tell a story about a man who made money and possessions his God. You realize of the 38 parables that Jesus told, 16 of them deal with money? Jesus seems to make it abundantly clear that the God of money is often God's main competition for our hearts. The problem isn't money. Money is amoral. It's not good or bad in and of itself. But it holds the most potential to become a substitute for God. Money is often portrayed as God's main competition in our lives. Just like this man in Luke chapter 12, we all can very easily make our lives about money and possessions. Heard the story one time of a man named Frank Simmons. He was a man who was committed to doing whatever it took to be successful. He didn't come from a family with much money, but things were going to be different for him. Even when he was in high school, he evaluated his future careers based on what would make him the most money. He considered going into medicine, not because he was passionate about helping people, but because he knew the money was good. But he finally decided on being a stockbroker. He got married his senior year in college and soon started a family. But he's working 14 hours a day, and often that was 7 days a week. When he was at home, he found he was preoccupied with work and the state of his investments. Then he started his own company. His occupation became his preoccupation. He became known as one of the best market timers in the business world. He always seemed to know what was about to take a downturn and what the next sure thing would be. His wife would ask if they could go out sometime, just the two of them. She tried to remind him how quickly the kids were growing up. There were little league games and dance recitals to attend. He'd usually say something like this: "Yeah, just let me get caught up. Next week should work." But he was always catching up. And before long, they stopped asking. They knew where they stood. Frank would occasionally go to church to be seen by some of his clients, but most of the time, his family would go without him. By the time he was 40 years old, Frank described himself as a self-made millionaire. But with the rise of the internet, Frank realized that he could make some real money providing online investment opportunities. He would check his stocks 20 times a day and watch his fortune grow. One weekend, he flew his wife to Naples, Italy, to show her the beachfront property he was going to purchase for their dream home. He told her the big news: "By this time next year, I'll take the company public. We'll be set for life. We'll have everything we could ever want. We'll be able to take life easy." She didn't say it out loud, but this is what she was thinking. Yeah, for Frank, there will never be enough. A few days later, back at the office, Frank closed on the property. That very night, he was driving his Mercedes home from the office, and he took a corner a little too fast. By the time they found Frank, he had already been dead for several hours. His death was big news in financial circles. His life was the American dream. But while he was being remembered here on earth as a huge success, Frank was standing before his Creator, trying to give an account for his life. It turns out that with all of his business accomplishments and his extraordinary portfolio, God wasn't impressed. He wasn't impressed with the car he drove or his vacation home or the company that he had built. Someone once said, "He who provides for this life but takes no care for eternity is wise for a moment but a fool forever." That's how the parable Jesus is going to tell might go if it were told these days. But here's how Jesus told the story in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 19. "And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry." Now, this parable gives us the description of someone who is worshiping the god of money. If you look closely, you'll notice that the man refers to himself 9 times in just 2 verses. He speaks of my crops, my barns, my grain. Let me ask you, who gave him the good crops? Who gave him the ability to get rich? It doesn't seem to occur to him that he has what he has because God has given it to him. And that's natural for us too. No one has to learn this attitude. Take a 2-year-old. That 2-year-old has a pretty limited vocabulary, but you could be sure he knows the word mine very well. Multiple times a day, children grab something and say, mine. They're consumed with establishing ownership rights. You can watch the cutest little child playing with a doll, and maybe that doll is singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and that little girl is humming along with it. But then you let another child see that doll and want that doll, and then goes over and takes that doll from that little girl. That little girl is going to unleash wrath on that other child, and her fury will be of demonic proportions. You know, when we approach money from the perspective that it belongs to us, it just doesn't work. The key to keeping money in its rightful place is to remember that it all belongs to God. When we understand this principle, it'll help us understand our true dependence upon God. God has given us the use of His resources for a short time here on earth, and we have much to be grateful for. Go do this exercise. Go through your day sometime and realize that everything is God's. You get out of God's bed. You walk into God's bathroom. You turn on God's shower and then put on God's clothes. You eat God's breakfast and drink God's coffee. You get in God's car to go to the job that God gave you. Now, you do that little simple observation a couple of days in a row. It'll help us realize and understand and develop an attitude of gratitude that will lead to a true heart of worship. The reason money ends up so often being God's main competition is that we tend to ascribe divine attributes to money. We look to money to do for us the very thing that God wants to do for us. The man in Jesus' parable does this very same thing. First, he looks to money as his source of security. He tells himself that he has plenty of good things laid up for many years. We think if we could just save enough or accumulate enough, we would have no more worries or problems. When we look to money for our security, we're looking at it as a god because that's where we are putting our hope and our dependence. Prayer becomes a nice thing, but not a necessity because we have enough money to meet our own needs. The god of money appeals to our sense of self-sufficiency, which means once we attain a certain level, we tend to forget that we need God. Second, the man in Jesus' story looks to money as a source of satisfaction. He thinks to himself, if I can just accumulate a little more crop, I can take life easy. Even before the good crop, this man was already wealthy, but he thinks that if he just had a little bit more, then he would be satisfied. But you have to wonder if things continue to go his way, would his new barns be big enough? Or would his happiness depend on getting even bigger barns? A 2006 study found that someone making $20,000 per year will be happier than someone at the poverty level. Well, obviously, he isn't worried about his next meal or whether he's going to continue to have a place to live. But more money doesn't determine a person's level of happiness. Someone who makes $100,000 a year isn't much happier than the person making $20,000 annually. Huge difference in salary, but a minimal difference in happiness. Many times the wealthier a person is, the less time they spend pursuing enjoyable activities. Last, the man in Jesus' story looks to money as his source of significance. His focus is on himself and how much he's accumulated. He clearly found his identity in his stuff. We tend to do the same thing. We judge our worth by our net worth. In his biography entitled Just As I Am, the Reverend Billy Graham tells a story about meeting one of the richest men alive. This is a quote from his book, and he says this: "Some years ago, Ruth and I were on an island in the Caribbean. One of the wealthiest men in the world had asked us to come to his lavish home for lunch. He was 75 years old, and throughout the entire meal, he seemed close to tears. 'I'm the most miserable man in the world,' he finally said. 'Out there's my yacht. I can go anywhere I want to. I have my private plane, my helicopters. I have everything I want to make my life happy, but I am miserable.'" Billy Graham goes on to say, "We talked to him and prayed with him, trying to point him to Christ, who alone gives lasting meaning to life. Then we went down the hill to a small cottage where we were staying. That afternoon, the pastor of the local Baptist church came to call. He was an Englishman, and he too was 75, a widower who spent most of his time taking care of his two invalid sisters. He was full of enthusiasm and love for Christ and others. He said, "I don't have 2 pounds to my name." But with a smile, he continued and said, "But I am the happiest man on this island." Billy Graham relates how he asked his wife Ruth after they left, "Who do you think is the richer man?" She just smiled. You see, it was a rhetorical question because the answer was obvious. The God of money wants us to believe that our significance comes from what we make of ourselves. But we find our true identity in Christ. He's marked us as his own, and that's what makes us valuable. That's where our value is found. He forever determined our value when he died on the cross of Calvary for us. But when we worship the God of money, a person's worth is determined not by the symbol of the cross, but by the symbol of the dollar sign. The man in Luke 12 had put his trust in his money and his possessions. His plan was to retire early and be happy. But that's not what happened. In verse 20, the Bible tells us the end of the story, when Jesus calls this man a fool and tells him that that very night he would die and that his accumulated wealth would buy him nothing but a nicer funeral. You know, it's possible that you have given money some of this divine attribute. Are you looking to money to do for you what God wants to do for you? Isn't it ironic that our money in America says, "In God we trust"? It's engraved right on it. But we tend to trust the money more than God. We trust money as a God rather than the God of heaven who provides for us. How we handle our money will be answered by the question of who or what we trust in. Jesus said in Matthew 6:21 that where our treasure is, our heart will be also. Where we put our money reveals what we've put our trust in. Let's take a few moments right now. Let's identify this financial God that wars against the God of heaven. I want you to click the video description below and answer the questions honestly and come prepared to discuss them.